Mutiny, open revolt against a constituted authority. Welcome back to Bloody Violent History. This is our penultimate episode before our season year end. My name is Tom Assheton and his name is James Jackson. And as ever, we ask you to pass this on to a friend or to give us a review. In today's episode, we're going to discuss the types of mutiny and how these have presented in naval, army and air force organisations. There have been the famous mutinies, such as in April 1789 aboard HMS Bounty. There have been great mutinies. Examples include several in Russia, and the Indian Mutiny of 1857. They can start as a small event, and in the right conditions can grow into a general insurrection. It is never just about native girls and rum. There is always an underlying grievance. In Shakespeare, Julius Caesar, Mark Antony turns the Roman mob against the dictator's assassins. But were I Brutus and Brutus Antony, there was an Antony would ruffle up your spirits and put a tongue in every wound of Caesar, that should move the stones of Rome to rise and mutiny. And if a mutiny is conducted by, say, a senior military officer against the political leadership, then you have a coup. Jamie, before you perform your best Captain Blythe, can we have some definitions, some causes, and some types of mutiny?
I would always say that mutiny is essentially insubordination that turns to insurrection. And it is obviously against authority. If it's against the supreme commander, the political leadership, then it becomes a coup. And there are many different layers and levels of mutiny, scale of mutiny. But as you said, there is an underlying grievance. I mean, sometimes it's about food. I mean, if you look at the Bounty, which we're going to talk about later, some say it was because Fletcher Christian was tapping into the private store of coconuts owned by Captain William Bligh, or it's
never meddle with another man's coconuts.
Well, exactly, or it's breadfruit taking up too much of the ship, too much of the space. And frankly, when it comes again to the Bounty, why would you want to leave a tranquil, idyllic island, and go to sea, and with all the rigours that entails? And then, of course, you get other. It's funny how food so often plays a part. You look at the Potemkin mutiny later on in Russia. That really started with rotten meat being given to the sailors. So there's always that sort of element. But underneath it all, there's deeper grievance. And you look at the 1905 revolution in Russia, for example, you get social change. You look at what happened on board US Navy ships during the Vietnam War, and you can see that such things as anti-Vietnam War sentiments or civil rights movement, those sort of things flow down to the grievance on board ships, or the grievance in groups of soldiers, for example. So there's a wider aspect. And sometimes it flows the other way. So the mutiny flows upwards and goes back, feeds back into the revolution. And so again with Russia, you get that in 1917. You see mutinies on the front, Russia's Western Front. You see that flowing back into the Bolshevik Revolution. So these things flow both ways, and mutiny can escalate, and escalate quite rapidly.
Before we get on to the Navy, we're going to just talk about a few examples of these definitions of mutiny. And so just to summarize, the mutiny itself is when a group of people, especially soldiers or sailors, refuse to obey orders. And or attempts to take control of those in charge. The causes of mutiny: poor conditions, a drunken rampage, cultural differences, ethnic tension, political and ideological differences, social upheaval and change. And then the types of mutiny: mass desertion, insurgency, strikes, assassination against superiors. It's always some form of attack or disregard against authority, against a grievance.
And Tom, we talked about food coming into it, but you go forward to 1972 and USS Kitty Hawk, and there you have the sort of wider tensions on civil rights and the treatment of black sailors coming to the fore, and that was started with an argument over a sandwich in the canteen. So again, food comes into it, but it's part of a wider problem.
A bit like prison riots, isn't it? I suppose they often
precisely.
start
Something sparks it. We're going on to historical examples, but when you look at British mutinies, for example, and particularly in the Royal Navy, you have to look at the wider picture and see that so many of these occurred just at the time that the French Revolution was breaking out. And so the authorities, the British authorities, were terrified that this sort of revolutionary zeal
turn into something more.
That not only would turn into something more among the fleet, but also that would spread back on shore and turn into something wider in society. So there was always that undercurrent, and it's worth sort of keeping that in mind, particularly when we turn to our first historical example,
which is HMS Hermione off Puerto Rico.
Exactly, and that was 1797, and the captain there was a total psychopath, Hugh Piggott. He was notorious, and again, it's so often it's this sort of response by a crew. Although it became this sort of drunken rampage, there was this overarching sort of loathing for this not just a disciplinarian, but a sadist and a psychopath, and he was certainly brave. I mean, he was involved in leading a squadron to cut out 9 enemy ships. I mean, he was very successful. But, come his Caribbean cruise, his cruising around the West Indies, he became more and more irrational, a terrible disciplinarian. He would flog people for almost no reason at all. And he'd flog the last men to come down from the topsails, for example. And there was one time when they were all so desperate to get down from the topsail that 3 of them fell to their death, and he just had them thrown overboard.
Throw the lovers overboard.
Exactly, and that is not going to make you popular among a crew that's stuck with you for a long cruise. And there was a midshipman, Casey, who failed to fix a gasket. And he had him flogged and forced him to kneel, wanted him to kneel in front of him to admit to all his faults. You just don't do that to a midshipman, to the youngest officer in the boat. It's a terrible way of behaving. And so, there came an evening where members of the crew were drunk, and they went on a rampage, and they forced their way into the captain's cabin, stabbed him with cutlasses and knives, and threw him and all the other officers overboard, killed them. Midshipman Casey was spared, but the officers were killed. The crew handed the ship over to the Spanish in Venezuela, who parked it in Puerto Cabello. And that's where it stayed until the Brits came back under the command, HMS Surprise, under the command of Captain Edward Hamilton, and did an amazing cutting out raid in 1799 and got the ship back. They went in small boats. They surprised the Spanish. They killed 119 Spanish, took over 230 prisoners. For that, Captain Hamilton was knighted and later on became a rear admiral. It's so Horatio Hornblower.
Yeah. And he none of his men were killed. He had 11 injured, and he was pretty badly wounded himself.
Yeah, and it shows that the Royal Navy at its best at the time, the commanders and the crews were phenomenal. And you can see why they were so feared, because they dominated the seas and the sea lanes. But it just took a wrong 'un like Hugh Piggott to cause a fray, cause a problem, create a mutiny. on board the ship. But so often it's the environment. If the environment is bad, if war is destroying morale, if they're really under pressure, a crew has its breaking point. It can crack. And you wind forward to 1942 and Operation Pedestal, taking the convoy, that famous convoy with the oiler Ohio to Malta. And there was a ship, Brisbane Star, and they were attacked all the time. The bow was almost torpedoed off. I mean, it was in a terrible state. And the crew and officers turned on the captain, and they could have mutinied. They absolutely wanted that ship to turn for the North African coast and surrender to the Vichy French. But the captain said, nope, we're going ahead. And luckily a destroyer turned up and it followed the destroyer and it headed for Malta, and actually was one of the 4 ships that made it to Malta. And but the pressure on those crews, if you take the Ohio, 2 German aircraft were shot down and landed on the ship. I mean, it arrived in Grand Harbour with a Junkers 87. Well, not just the remains, the actual aircraft, the Junkers 87 and the Junkers 88 Chanel bomber sticking out of the deck. I mean, this is how intense it was. But under that sort of pressure, crews can crack, and there is the possibility of a mutiny. But going back to old Hugh Piggott, Captain Hugh Piggott on the Hermione, it was his behaviour that caused this resentment, caused this upsurge in violence by the crew, plus a bit of alcohol, of course.
Well, those are sort of examples from the past, but the more recent past, post-World War II, there have been quite a few incidents, especially around the time of Vietnam in the 60s and 70s. But before we go there, let's have a word about a couple of incidents that happened in Soviet period in Russia. So first one we've got is the Jonas Plesky.
There you get the captain, Jonas Plesky, who commanded the barge Smolny, and just like Hunt for Red October, he decides to defect. He didn't actually tell his crew what was going on, and it ended up with a chase as he headed for Sweden, but he actually made it. And once more, like the French Revolution, it was the sort of wider political aspect of what was going on in society that sort of created these situations.
Yeah, and his parents were in Siberia.
That's right, and Plesky had actually sort of written tracts, hadn't he, as a schoolboy to against the regime. I mean, he was not in favour of the regime, but was basically pressed into service, military service. It was just a barge, of course, but later on in the 1970s, you get a different type of mutiny, because there you have the political officer of a frigate, a Soviet frigate, actually wanting to take on the authorities because he felt they weren't communist enough.
Valery Sablin.
That's right, and Sablin believed that the communist regime were the Brezhnev regime were corrupt, that they weren't committed enough to the ideal of communism, and he wanted to broadcast to the nation. He sort of positioned his frigate. He wanted to sort of moor up against this sort of monument to the revolution and broadcast to the nation. And in the end, he was captured. His own crew took him on, and he was captured and later executed. But it shows that these sort of these wider social movements, these political movements, can affect and infect the morale and the outlook of crews or of soldiers. And you mentioned Vietnam and the
U.S. Army's troubles that they had, essentially from an army that was suffering from a great deal of discipline deterioration.
There are so many examples of the sort of decline in discipline during the Vietnam War. And once you get the draft coming in, you get people being pressed into military service, fighting a campaign in which they don't want to be involved.
They don't understand.
They don't understand. You've got the peace movement back home. So you get instances like the 1968 Presidio stockade, and it's so 1960s, where sort of inmates, people sitting down and singing "We Shall Overcome." I mean, it's everything you imagine the 1960s to be. And at the same time, you had this huge upsurge in fragging, the killing of officers in Vietnam. It's believed there were sort of 900 fragging instances using fragmentation grenades or shooting officers. So this was going on, and it reflected the sort of wider problems in society and the wider debate and insubordination that was going on. The problem is, in these sort of wars that people don't understand or that are not popular at home, of course it's going to filter down. And you get an incident like the Columbia Eagle in 1970, where 2 crewmen went and mutinied and took over the ship that was carrying napalm to Vietnam. And with a pistol and the threat of a bomb going off, they said, right, you're going to take the ship. They ordered the captain to take the ship to Cambodia. And so they sailed for Cambodia, whereupon they were promptly incarcerated and put in a rusting metal shed on the Mekong, in the Mekong Delta. After a while, I think sitting in a shed and just getting stoned affected both of them rather badly. This was McRae and Glitowski. And so Glitowski ended up going back to the US, spending time in jail. McRae stayed. And it was only in 1991 that the body of McRae was found. He had plainly been killed by the Khmer Rouge. But this was a pair that had gone so off-piste. I mean, it's so like Apocalypse Now. They were sort of in favor of Charles Manson. They wanted to overthrow the US government. They claimed they were as one with the Asian people, that they and it started really from this sort of anti-Vietnam War thing and the fact that they had been transporting napalm. So that is a sort of indication of how different people, different crew, who are not subject to military discipline or have flouted it, can rise up against authority and go their own way.
The history of mutiny essentially goes back all the way to the beginning of military operations. I mean, even in the period of Alexander 326 BC, there was a mutiny when his Macedonians finally got to the borders of the Indian subcontinent, and he was still gung-ho and ready to keep going, and they said they'd had enough. They were probably carrying their spoils of war on their backs for too long, and they'd been nearly 8 years in foreign lands, fighting in danger, and they wanted to go home.
Yeah, and discontent can spread. I mean, they didn't overthrow him. They didn't sort of topple him from his position.
But he had a change of heart.
Well, exactly, and he listened to what was being said, and you get these flare-ups. So you look at the Roman army; did exactly the same. Were jealous of the local population in Campania, and that they mutinied. They sort of voiced their discontent.
Yeah, and the dictator Marcus Valerius Corvus, who was nominated dictator to solve the problem, managed to solve it through peaceful means, and the mutineers received amnesty. Laws were passed to address their concerns.
Yeah, that was 4th century BC. So, but
it may actually be made up, that one, by later Romans
or by
trying
us.
to prove a political point.
But you go forward again. You see, we'll mention it later. But I mean, the French army in 1917, they had been absolutely sort of beasted during.
This is Verdun.
This is actually the Second Battle of Aisne. The attempt to sort of mount an offensive against the Germans, thinking this would break the Germans, and the British had the Battle of Arras, and the Brits had lost 160,000 men killed or wounded in that battle. They didn't mutiny. But again, you can see sort of, French morale had been absolutely flattened. Again, we'll talk about this. But 40,000 men or more mutinied. And this showed that the war, the general conditions, could spark problems in the wider army, and you get that in campaign after campaign and country after country. This is what happens when people have their breaking point, and that is reached.
Right, on to our specific areas for mutinies. This is about naval mutinies, and we have to start with one of the most famous ones. There have been 3 movies on this particular mutiny. Can you guess which one it is, Jamie?
Oh, it's got to be Mutiny on the Bounty.
Indeed, 28th of April 1789. HMS Bounty, captained by Lieutenant William Bligh, and it's the contest of wills between him and Fletcher Christian, master's mate. Yes, 28th of April 1789. HMS Bounty, this was a ship that was set to collect breadfruit from Tahiti and take these plants to West Indies. Anyway, the sailors had spent some time on Tahiti, and they had enjoyed a lifestyle of sexual opportunities for several months, so their discipline had become rather ragged. Their captain was Lieutenant William Bligh, and he was harsh in handing out punishments, and he was particularly harsh on Fletcher Christian, the first mate, who became eventually the leader of the mutiny.
I think, Tom, if I'd sat on Tahiti for 5 months, I would have stayed there. I mean, who's going to opt to be surrounded by breadfruit stuffed on board a ship? I mean, very cramped conditions.
It's a very small ship.
There was a small ship, crew of 44, and Bligh was a disciplinarian, but he was also a superb navigator. I mean, he had first gone to CH7 as a cabin servant on a ship, and so he had learnt his trade from a very early age. It was superb at navigation. That's what saved him and the others who went on board, the loyalists who were put on a small boat with him, on a long boat with him. I mean, for someone to be able to navigate a longboat 3,600 nautical miles, that's quite something. And so he wanted the crew to get back on board, to stuff the ship with breadfruit, and Fletcher Christian, having sort of been insulted, having been accused of stealing those coconuts.
And being a damned cowardly rascal.
Well, exactly, because he had failed to put down a native insurrection on another island. And these were violent times. I mean, these were, it wasn't all peace and harmony on these islands. I mean, there were war canoes, there were attacks by natives, they attacked natives. And, in the end, Fletcher Christian led a revolt, grabbed the captain.
Yeah, early hours of the 28th of April, Christian took Bligh from his room, and before the rest of the crew, who had nothing to do with either side, could get involved, he'd surrounded himself by support.
Well, that's right. And once more, it's not just the conditions they were leaving, that they didn't want to leave. It was also the fact that Bligh had cut their rum ration, had cut their food ration by half to discipline them. And so this insurrection occurred. And sort of, Bligh got into this longboat with 18 others. And the ones that Fletcher Christian kept, he kept the carpenter and the armourer behind because he knew that he would need them. He would need them. I don't think he had a fully formed idea of what he would do, but Bligh went off in his craft, and Fletcher Christian was left, went to buy another island and decided to set up shop there. And he went back to Tahiti, told the island chiefs that Bligh and James Cook, who was already dead by that stage, of course. Bligh had once served on the last voyage with Cook, so he was an old hand, great navigator. But Fletcher Christian took a whole load of Polynesians with him, and mutineers to Tobai. And that was a disaster. The locals didn't welcome them. There were fights. There were insurrections among his own men. Some of them wanted to go back to Tahiti. And in the end, they did go back to Tahiti, and many stayed there.
Yeah, at that stage, there were only 9 left on the Bounty from the original mutineers, as well as 14 women.
There weren't 6 of them all elderly.
And some older ladies who they dropped off on an island. Had no use for them.
It didn't quite fit with his overall approach. That's when they made it to Pitcairn and decided to settle there. But that wasn't a bed of roses either. I mean, by the time that you get into the sort of early 19th century, there's one survivor left. I mean,
They'd
the
all
others,
fallen out with each other, apart from the others.
Yeah, they had killed each other. They were killed by the Polynesians they had taken with them. They were killed by the locals. They had died from disease. It was not a happy bunch. But Fletcher Christian had left a son. Many of them had had children by that stage. And it's Fletcher Christian's son who is really the spawner of generations of Pitcairn Islanders from that point on.
Anyone with the name Christian on the Pitcairn Island comes from that.
That's right.
Starting point.
And there have been all sorts of problems with those islanders in terms of inbreeding, of accusations of abuse. I mean, this is island living. It is not the paradise that the mutineers expected it to be. And in the meantime, while they were all dying off, Bligh managed to make it 3,600 miles to Timor. And they were all falling out. There were other sort of minor mutinies on his small boat, and he even had a punch-up. He even challenged one of his men to a fight.
The carpenter.
Yeah. So it wasn't going well, but he made it back, and he was exonerated. He was acquitted in a court-martial when he got back to England, and later he became the Governor General of New South Wales in Australia. So it's an irony that he was facing a rebellion on the Bounty for cutting the rum ration, and all those years later he faced an insurrection over cutting the rum and the rum racketeering.
I think
New
some
South
of
Wales.
the cutting of ration, certainly on the boat, was because you could supplement your own income by basically feeding your men less. You could.
Well, that was
make
one
money
of the problems. But as governor of New South Wales, he ended up under house arrest. So on the Bounty, he was put in a small boat. In New South Wales, he was put under armed house arrest. But in a way, that was more of a coup than a mutiny. I mean, this was the military turning on him. But
he had an exciting career, Bligh.
He did, and he ended up as a rear admiral. So you
can go and see his tomb, which is behind Lambeth Palace in the little church by the roundabout on the south of Lambeth Bridge. If you go in there, it's a garden museum, I think, but his tomb is right in the middle. So it's quite a fancy thing. So no doubt he had 1 or 2 people who were prepared to put a bit of money into his memory.
Exactly. He's probably not well remembered in Tahiti or Pitcairn.
Can you imagine what someone like him is when he gets to the pearly gates? Like, where are we going to put this guy?
But I mean, this was the thing about these naval commanders. I mean, you're on tour. Tough. They're not only were they tough, but you were with your crew for a very long period, and you take amazing commanders like Admiral Collingwood. I don't think he went ashore for 3 years. I mean, this is what one has to remember. I mean, they were very isolated, insular communities on board these ships.
Yeah.
So,
and if women were involved in this situation, it did make things very complicated, didn't it?
Well, of course it did. And I certainly would have stayed on Tahiti. I'd be with the Christian lot.
You're wearing the grass skirt today. It looks very nice, even though it's the winter.
I've gone native.
Your coconuts are showing through the grass. Okay, enough of that. Right. Continuing with the theme of concern over the French Revolution spreading to England, there are a couple of mutinies in the Navy that were sort of land-based. First of all, we've got the Spithead Mutiny.
Yes, 1797, and this was incredibly important. I mean, this showed the concern of the authorities, and what's fascinating about that, it was an economic grievance. It was about pay. It was about conditions. And it was this worry by the authorities that not only would the French revolutionary fervour spread among the fleet, but also that it would make England, it would make Britain vulnerable to French attack. And this was at a time, the rise of Napoleon, the revolutionary fervour of France. Had we been unable to blockade the French or fight them, we would have been in trouble. So,
but these mutineers did actually say that they would go to sea if French ships were spotted.
Completely.
And they would suspend the mutiny.
Completely. And this is what really stopped the mutiny becoming treason. And that's why, you got people like Lord Howe getting involved. And, the demands of the mutineers were actually met. The conditions, unpopular officers were redeployed. The men who were involved, there were pay rises. The men who were involved in the mutiny were pardoned. Now, the same year, you got the Nore mutiny, and that became far more serious because you started getting revolutionary pamphlets being printed. You got a blockade of London. You got the leader of that mutiny, Richard Parker.
Yeah, the president of the delegates of the fleet is what he called himself.
Yes, it began to start sounding revolutionary. And when you got Richard Parker threatening to take those ships across to France, then you had the mutiny turning into treason, into high treason in a sense. Most of the sailors in the Royal Navy would not have approved of that at all. And I think that that's when support started falling away. And in the end, those mutineers were captured. 29 were hanged, including
Richard Parker, who was hanged for treason and piracy.
And this was for both mutiny and treason. So you can see that it was more serious. And the authorities were not going to tolerate this lasting any longer.
Even some were sent to Australia, were transported to Australia, with 9 also being flogged and 29 imprisoned.
That's right. They should have been sent to Tahiti or Pitcairn to add to the numbers.
Tender breadfruit. Well, in 1842, there was the USS Somers affair, which is a strange kind of mutiny. It was a kind of mutiny with a commercial purpose behind it.
Well, it was a commercial purpose because you had a midshipman who, give him credit, he seemed to be a sort of tour de force. He seemed to be operating on his own and decided to mount an insurrection because he wanted to take hold of the ship and turn it over to piracy and become a pirate. But this was well after, you're talking the 1840s. This was well after the heyday of piracy. So I don't know what he was
100
thinking.
years, wouldn't it be?
Yeah, it is absolutely extraordinary, and it was never going to work. And the captain found out about it, put spies onto him, intercepted sort of communications that he was making in sort of Greek lettering and things like that, and it ended up with a hanging. But it was a sort of strange one-off in U.S. naval history, just in terms of both the hanging and in terms of the sort of direct challenge to the captain.
Right, to stay with the theme of naval mutinies on land, we have the Port of Chicago mutiny in 1944, July the 17th. And this was started when munitions were being loaded onto a cargo vessel bound for the Pacific. And they went off, killing 320 sailors and injuring 390 others. 2/3 of them were African-American sailors who had been exclusively assigned to load the dangerous munitions. A month after, hundreds of servicemen then refused to load munitions, and they were sentenced to 15 years of prison, hard labour, and a dishonourable discharge. 47 of the 50 men were released in January 1946. Inadequate training was one of the main causes, as well as hazardous conditions. But it is an example of the US Navy's use of black servicemen in dangerous conditions. This contributed to the eventual desegregation of the military in 1948.
Yes, I mean, you talk about desegregation, but of course this reared its head again later on in the 1970s. And so you still have these problems. And when you've got a war and when you've got these other social issues going on, then you get these sort of flare-ups. And I mentioned earlier the Kitty Hawk in 1972, the aircraft carrier USS Kitty Hawk, and talked about the sandwich incident, but again, it was simply an indication of wider problems. And you look at the Subic Bay naval base, there's segregation going on there. You had the jungle and the strip, which is what the two different groups, their sort of mess halls were called, their recreation facilities were called, and they did not mix. And they were patrolled by Marines, these areas, and one side wouldn't go to the other side. And once you get on board a ship of 4,500 crew, where only 7% of that vessel are black, and the black crew fill those most menial jobs, then you've got a recipe for tension. And so it proved. And those tensions and those brawls that were occurring in Subic Bay flared up on the ship. And you had 40 black sailors arming themselves with broom handles and wrenches and trying to take over parts of the ship. You had the US Marines getting involved to patrol the ship. Then you had 150 white sailors arming themselves to fight back. I mean, this was a huge problem. And you had the one sort of mixed race officer, Ben Cloud, trying to calm matters down. And it alternated between flare-ups and then the crew sort of gathering on the deck to play cards and drink and everything else and socialize. But then these sort of new flare-ups would occur. And it's what we've said all the way through, that sort of wider social divisions often sort of infect the what is going on. At the military level or at the naval level, this can be a problem. And the early 70s and the late 1960s were a terrible time for tension. And the Kitty Hawk incident was just one of those times.
27 black sailors were arrested and charged, whereas no white sailors were charged after returning to California.
Yeah, and you see what happened after the Port Chicago incident back in the 40s. Most of them were released sort of after the end of the Second World War. But if there is a campaign going on, if there's a war going on, the stakes are so much higher. And the authorities, the naval authorities, the command cannot allow this sort of insurrection to spread. And that is one of the problems.
I think it's Sergei Eisenstein's movie, The Battleship Potemkin, which is a famous piece of Russian propaganda. And in 1905, the battleship Potemkin mutinied.
And like so many mutinies and like so many revolutions, it's all a little haphazard. And it started with this sort of maggot-infested borscht the crew didn't want to eat. And then the second in command pulling up tarpaulins because he planned to shoot the protesters, the mutineers. And so they shot him. And then there was a bit of a shootout, a bit of a blood spill, and the captain was killed and other officers were killed. 8 officers in total, including the captain, were gunned down. And quite a few of the mutineers as well. And the Potemkin then started sailing around, and some Imperial Russian ships tried to intervene and stop it. One ship tried to ram it. Other ships refused to fire, and it went to Romania. It went back to Crimea, tried to pick up coal and food. At one point, it fired 2 6-inch shells at the theatre in Odessa. which was housing Imperial Army officer staff, and but it missed, and it sort of sailed around, desperately trying to find safe haven. And other ships actually wanted to join it as well in this sort of revolutionary fervour and revolutionary farce, if you like. And this was really the first Russian revolution. And Potemkin is so totemic of that, so symptomatic of that period. You know, it was the start of revolutionary fervour. And
it became part of the sort of propaganda history of the...
It did. It became part of the folklore and part of the sort of first time that sort of red flag was flying on board Russian Navy ships, and you know, and of course there was a sort of military revolution going on at the same time in places like Odessa. There was mutiny going on all over the place. I mean, eventually it died out and was put down, and the Potemkin sort of managed to sail to Romania, and Romania allowed the crew to surrender, and the ship had a Romanian flag sort of put up. But in the meantime, the crew sort of scuttled the ship, and it half sank in Romanian port. So it had a sort of bit of an odyssey. It had a rather sort of peripatetic sort of wandering around the Black Sea before it found its eventual home.
And then step on a few years, 15 years, and you've got the Black Sea Mutiny of 1919, which is not, as you might think, a Russian mutiny, but in fact a French ship's crew.
And once more, you can see the impact of societal trends, and also the sort of exhaustion of war. You're talking 1919, so the armistice had been signed, but between the sort of powers in Europe, I mean, there was no war left going on the Western Front. The French sailors and officers didn't want to be there. And so you started getting friendships putting up the revolutionary flag, putting up the red flag. And they didn't want to be there because France was supporting the White Russians against the Bolsheviks. And many of the crew didn't like this. They wanted to go home. They wanted better conditions. Yet again, they wanted better food. They wanted to be granted leave.
And they had sympathy with the Red Russians.
Well, they certainly did, and hence the sort of raising of the Russian, of the red flag. And all the way through history, like the Italian Ancona mutiny in 1920, or the Greek Navy mutinying in the 1940s towards the end of the Second World War, you had these flare-ups that are revolutionary fervour, and in a way all the tension, all the relief of war coming to an end, and people wanting to go home, this fueled the discontent, the general discontent that fed into mutiny.
But sometimes it's a bit more prosaic in that what they really want is leave, better pay, and food, and you know, the fine line of having a mutiny that doesn't end up with you hanging from the gibbet because of sort of legitimate claims, because there are occasions where they then did get better paid and did get better conditions.
Yes, and I think that the sort of, whether it's sort of arguing about a sandwich on the Kitty Hawk or arguing about rum rations on the Bounty, these are sort of symptomatic of overall conditions, of an overall regime that the crew doesn't like and doesn't respond to, and it causes the flashpoint. You'll find that the sort of rum ration or the food issue is simply one of many other complaints and wider problems that are occurring.
Very good. Now let's go on to army mutinies, and we'll start with the big one, which is the Indian Mutiny of 1857.
The Indian Mutiny, scene of the massacre of British women and children at Cawnpore, the 21st of July, 1857. Report of an officer in General Havelock's relieving force. The mutiny began at Meerut but spread to other cities, including Cawnpore, where the Nana Sahib, the native ruler, massacred the entire garrison, including 200 women and children who were hacked to death in a house known as the Bibigar. I was directed to the house where all the poor, miserable ladies had been murdered. It was alongside the Cawnpore Hotel, where the Nana, i.e. Nana Sahib, lived. I never was more horrified. The place was one mass of blood. I'm not exaggerating when I tell you that the soles of my boots were more than covered with the blood of these poor wretched creatures. Portions of their dresses, collars, children's socks, and ladies' round hats lay about, saturated with their blood. And in the sword cuts on the wooden pillars of the room, long dark hair was carried by the edge of the weapon, and there hung their tresses, a most painful sight. I have often wished since that I had never been there, but sometimes wish that every soldier was taken there, that he might witness the barbarities our poor countrywomen had suffered. Their bodies were afterwards dragged out and thrown down a well outside the building, where their limbs were to be seen, sticking out in a mass of gory confusion. Those poor ladies were massacred on the 15th, after we had thrashed the blackguards at the bridge. The collector, who gave the order for their death, was taken prisoner the day before yesterday, and now hangs from a branch about 200 yards off the roadside. His death was, accidentally, a most painful one, for the rope was badly adjusted, and when he dropped, the noose closed over his jaw. His hands then got loose, and he caught hold of the rope and struggled to get free, but the two men took hold of his legs and jerked his body until his neck broke. This seemed to me the just reward he should have got on earth for his barbarity.
Yeah, and we've mentioned the sort of social trends, social pressures, and changes in society that can induce a mutiny and encourage an upsurge in insubordination and insurrection. And the Indian Mutiny is a perfect example of this. You have everything we talked about at the beginning. You've got discontent at conditions, you've got clash of cultures, you've got Indian troops believing that Indian culture is under threat. You've got Christian missionaries coming into India, and locals didn't like that. And on top of all of this, on top of Maharajas seeing land confiscated by the East India Company, you had this flashpoint, and we've talked about flashpoints already, but this flashpoint was, of course, the new cartridge for the Enfield rifle that was coming into service. And this was considered by both Hindu and Muslim troops absolutely unacceptable. And the rumour went round that the lard used in the cartridge that had to be torn open with the teeth, that Hindus believed that there might be cow fat involved, and that was sacred to Hindus. That was an absolute no-no. And of course for Muslims there was a belief that pig fat was involved, and that was completely forbidden in the Muslim faith. So you started getting this insurrection that spread very rapidly, and by the end you had almost 100,000 Indian troops, Indian sepoys, rising up against British influence, British control,
the East India Company.
The East India Company, and it had huge ramifications, because after that the British government took control. It was no longer the East India Company after that. It was the British Empire. It was the Raj, part of the British Empire.
But it did effectively start on the 29th of March in 1857 with the firing of a shot.
Yes, at a British sergeant major. It missed, but the culprit was then
Mangal Pandre.
Yes, he was captured and hanged, and but that was really the start, and you got it spreading very quickly, and the rebel army sort of put a Maharaja, sort of elected a new sort of Mughal emperor, if you like, and everyone rallied around that. They even printed their own currency. So this was a sort of, although it was haphazard and you got individual incidents, you had a real problem for the British at this point. And they attacked, the Brits attacked Delhi to try and remove the mutinous sepoys there. And it was a big siege. You had the Highland regiments involved, you had the Gurkhas involved, you had the Punjab movable column coming in. This was the far-fighting force, really, of the East India Company that could move very rapidly to put down dissent, put down uprisings. And so you saw this mutiny, this Indian mutiny, develop into what you could really call a civil war. This was cities being besieged. And there was street fighting. The Brits had to bring up a sort of an armoured train. You had artillery involved, and you had a lot of destruction. And once the British and their loyal sepoys got into the city, you had a lot of destruction going on, and a lot of deaths ensued. And in the meantime, you also had big sieges at places like Lucknow.
Yes, and this is a siege by the sepoys who are mutinying against Brits inside Lucknow, isn't it? So it's the reverse of Delhi.
Exactly. And it was a very desperate fight. I mean, you got commanders, Henry Lawrence, leading 700 men out to confront a mutinous sepoy force 10 times its size, and some of his force defected. His force was sort of routed. Later, he was killed. I mean, the sepoys,
that was in the middle of the day, wasn't it? It was boiling hot. It was a Mad Dogs and Englishmen moment.
It was a terrible decision, and this pell-mell retreat back to the residency. I mean, it was a small residency. It was just over 60 acres, and they fortified it. So you had 1,700 Brits in this residency. You had pensioners being formed into rifle groups and squads that would defend. Mine shafts were sunk, improvised bombs to try and stop the sepoys coming in. It was a very, very desperate fight. And relief columns did get through, but it took a while. And all the time, these relief columns, they had to bring their supplies. Those supplies were attacked. They had to fight skirmishes and other unit actions along the way. So it was very important for the East India Company and for overall British control in India to actually relieve Lucknow. It was a desperate attempt.
If you want a good picture of what it would be like in this siege, then read The Siege of Krishnapur, which is obviously a novel by J.G. Farrell, but it's an excellent and entertaining novel.
Yeah, we've mentioned it before because I always loved the scene in The Siege of Krishnapur where they run out of cannonballs for the cannon, and they fill it with silver tongs and a bust,
knives and forks.
Yes, and a bust of Queen Victoria who is fired. The unsmiling bust of Queen Victoria is fired from the cannon and removes the head of a mutinous sepoy. I just remember that. But this siege at Lucknow, it stands out because it lasted 7 months. I mean, it was an incredible hand-to-hand, visceral siege. Luckily, the residents there, those who were besieged, found a store of food that allowed them to last another sort of 2 months in the middle of that siege. I mean, they were running out of food and water. So this was absolutely critical to their survival. And eventually, after 2 or 3 of their commanders were killed, the British managed to get through, and it was the 93rd Highlanders who sort of broke through into the group of sort of mutinous sepoys who were besieging and laid waste to them. And it's said that the Highlanders were shouting, this is for Cawnpore, and remember Cawnpore, you bloody murderers. Because, of course, throughout the Indian Mutiny, there were massacres, and the Cawnpore massacre was one of the worst, was the worst. It was when sort of women and children were massacred, having been supposedly being given free passage out of Cawnpore, and then were set upon and murdered in their hundreds. And so that was something that British troops and Indian troops who were loyal to the British were not going to forgive or forget, and that drove them on.
And as you said, the East India Company was really done for after that, and it became part of the British Empire.
Yeah, it was a busted flush, and in a way, it brought to an end that whole period, the centuries-long period of individual companies carving up the world, and which had happened since Elizabethan times. You had different companies taking over, all parts of the world, and
Commercial ventures.
and raising shares for those commercial ventures. But after that, it was the British Army and the Raj.
Already mentioned are the Russian naval mutinies, and now we must mention the Russian army mutinies, in particular 1906.
Yes, Sveaborg in Finland, you got 2,000 men. They didn't like the conditions, they didn't like their food. Again, it comes down to food. And it is interesting that the 1905 mutinies were mostly naval. The army was sort of pretty apolitical. But, there were outposts, and it tends to be in sort of outposts of Russia that morale is affected, that things start breaking down. And you've seen that in more recent times, of course. It's the borderlands where there are problems.
And it's a good place to start work as an agitator, isn't it?
Well, yes, and there was a Bolshevik agitator involved in this one. But that was put down, and the ringleaders were hanged. And you move forward, of course, to the Russian Revolution. Of course, it was defeats that against the Germans that obviously caused real problems. And eventually led to the Russian Revolution. And again, there were sort of micro mutinies going on all over the place. I mean, when the Bolsheviks actually stormed the Winter Palace, one of the reasons they managed to do that was because the Cossack contingent, over 200 of them that were guarding the palace, they decided to go back to barracks and leave the Winter Palace. And you had the artillery cadets leave the Winter Palace as well. And one of the reasons the Bolsheviks were quite slow in going for the Winter Palace is that they didn't have enough artillery themselves. So, all the way through, mutiny feeds these problems. And we mentioned the French army mutiny of 1917. And once again, a bit like the sort of Spithead mutiny in the Royal Navy in the 18th century. Here you have the French army saying, we are not going to go on the attack anymore. We'll defend, if the Germans attack, but we don't want to get involved. We've just been involved in this suicidal battle. We've lost over 180,000 men, killed or wounded. The Brits have lost 160,000 at Arras.
And it's all very inconclusive as well.
It's all inconclusive, and it was just insane. And who should take over command after this? But Pétain, later of Vichy, France infamy. But over 20 mutineers, French mutineers, were hanged for what they had done. And
conditions were improved.
And conditions were improved. I mean, the people who didn't learn from this, of course, and those catastrophic losses, were the Brits. You look at the Battle of Arras, and actually, in terms of daily losses, they were higher. They were 4,000 casualties per day, which was more than the 3,000 a day during the Somme. So and then, of course, you get someone like Haig launching the Battle of Passchendaele later on, and part of it was to try and get to the coast and get hold and neutralize German submarine pens, but partly it was the British thinking, there's been a mutiny among the French, and the French have been sort of pushed into mutiny by not only their conditions and the losses, but also the fact the French army wanted the Americans to join the war more quickly than they had done. So the Brits then went into the Battle of Passchendaele, lasted about 100 days. And the Brits managed to lose 300,000 men, killed or wounded or just missing. So
in the mud.
They never learned from the Somme and from Battle of Arras. So that was another sort of consequence, unforeseen consequence of the French army mutiny. And so often you have these knock-on effects that people aren't expecting. But that is what happened with the French army mutiny of 1917.
Right, well, our last army mutiny is the Salerno mutiny, which is an example of mutiny in the Second World War. On 16th of September 1943, a group of British soldiers, 192, refused to be assigned to new units for the Italian campaign. They were veterans of Monti's 8th Army and had served in Africa, and they were expecting to go from Sicily to England, where they were going to take part in Operation Overlord, the invasion of Europe in 1944. However, there were heavy casualties in Salerno, and they were told to go and join two American infantry divisions, the 46th and 56th, which was part of the US Fifth Army. They were very unhappy about this. Their commanding officer, General McCreary, said that they could join their own units after Salerno was secure. However, 108 decided to follow orders, 192 didn't, and they were charged with the Mutiny Act and were sent off and incarcerated, 3 of their sergeants being sentenced to death.
You mentioned General Clark here, and I think he wasn't universally popular. And these soldiers had been taken away from the units that they had known. They thought they were going back to England. And the fact we're talking about it as a sort of isolated incident shows that how extraordinary it is that throughout this entire war, you got so few mutinies, you got so little insubordination and insurrection against commanders. And you know, this is really a one-off. And you know, it just shows how men by this stage were exhausted. I mean, they've been fighting a long time. And you know, at the end of it, those 192 were taken to French Algeria, and 3 of their sergeants were hanged, and the rest were disciplined and dismissed. But it was a bad incident, but it wasn't one that is particularly surprising, given the circumstances, given the toughness of the fighting through Italy, and we all know about Monte Cassino and other battles that went on. I mean, it was pretty grim. So you know, being taken away from your units and being put under other command and control of another nation is not going to be popular, and so one has to sort of view it in that light.
Air Force mutinies are not such a big thing as Army and Navy, but that's partly because they've only been around for 100 years. But we've got a couple of examples. In 1945, there was a US Air Force mutiny at Freeman Field. This occurred when some African-American members of the 477 Bombardment Group tried to go into an all-white officers' club. And essentially, they tried again and again, and eventually all 61 of them tried to go into the club, and they were arrested for insubordination.
And they were put under house arrest. And it was this sort of segregation that went on in the US military until 1949, when Truman abolished it. And you can see that even though there was this sort of official segregation, we talked about the Kitty Hawk incident and what was going on in Subic Bay in the early 1970s. And the fact that the black officers' mess was called Uncle Tom's Cabin by the white officers, the Air Force officers. And you got this strict segregation, and that the white officers were called advisory and the black officers were called trainees. So that's what allowed them to maintain that segregation. So once more, you see sort of societal changes, societal moves, the beginnings of civil rights movements sort of coming to the fore. And it's interesting that it was the black officers that were really pushing for this. You know, they were the ones who, in a group, en masse, were trying to get into the white officers' mess. And so there was this sort of racial tension that continued and went on for a long time.
And the 477th Group was essentially turned or renamed a composite group, and it was staffed with only black officers. The white officers were reassigned elsewhere.
Yes, and those black officers, those black pilots, were sent to Lockbourne Field, and that became the only airfield staffed exclusively by black Americans who served there until the late 1940s. So it was, that mutiny, that original mutiny, did have an impact and did start bringing in changes, did start creating a situation where societal changes were accommodated and introduced.
Well, many issues had been parked by the advent and prosecution of the Second World War, and one of them, of course, was what was going to happen in India. And in 1946, the Royal Air Force Indian Mutiny took place.
Yes, some people call it a mutiny, some people just call it a strike, and it certainly spread eventually through sort of 50,000 people, mostly ground crew, around the world, wherever Britain had sort of both colonies and air bases, I suppose. But we talked about the early mutiny among the US Air Force, but you have to see the conditions in India in 1946, and there were certainly grievances between those who worked for the Royal Indian Air Force and those who worked for the Royal Air Force. There was a sort of basic segregation there too.
But also they kind of wanted a segregation. They wanted to have a separate mess from so that they could have Indian films and a recreation room with Indian periodicals
and Indian food as well.
And, yeah.
But I mean, they basically wanted conditions that suited them.
Yeah, and equal rights.
And they saw that there was this sort of growing discontent, demob unhappiness, if you like. The fact that demobilization at the end of the war wasn't happening fast enough. They thought they were being kept on duty, on call, because of the sort of understanding there might be Indian uprisings, that they would be needed to quell any sort of societal problems. And of course this was happening. When you got Indian independence, you got huge problems. So there was this real feeling that they were being kept in place to put down future civil unrest, civil insurrection. But it was peaceful, this so-called mutiny. It was more a go slow. It was more of refusal to work. It was a sit down. Yeah. And as I said, it spread throughout many parts. It spread to Ceylon as well. So it was racing around the globe when people heard of it. And it was essentially war fatigue. And you saw this, we mentioned the French Navy in the Crimea, in the Black Sea in 1917. It was very much that same feeling that they shouldn't be there. They wanted to get home. They didn't like the conditions, and times they were a-changing. And we talked about this sort of societal shift, these social forces that are in place. And so it was both in India and elsewhere in the world. People were just weary of the war. And so it's worth ending on that note, that sometimes mutiny is really a reaction to the sort of changes that are happening. It's a response to a system that's kept in place beyond its sell-by date, that things have to change. And that's what this was in this place. And you talk about mutinies in the Air Force being not very common. And it's not very common because airfields are often sort of isolated places. They're in their own little sphere, and so it doesn't spread on the whole quite as fast as it does in armies or in navies. They're self-contained units, and it doesn't spread like wildfire. And also the people are technical on the whole, who work on bases or who fly the aircraft. So they are a different sort of person, if you like. It's not the poor bloody soldier fighting in the trenches. It's a completely different way of life and a different attitude.
Okay. Now, P.S.
The postscript is important, Tom, because it's to show that mutinies still continue. We had the mutiny that led to the coup attempt against Hitler and the Operation Valkyrie, the July 44 plot against Hitler. But then again, you had in the summer of 2023 the mutiny by the Wagner Group against Putin. And something that starts as just a measure of discontent among a mercenary group. They didn't like the conditions, they didn't like the human wave tactics that were being used where they were slaughtered, but most importantly, they didn't like the fact that they were going to be absorbed into the Russian army. And it was plainly a plot by the hierarchs in the Politburo and the Defense Ministry, who thought that Wagner and certainly Yevgeny Prigozhin had got above his station, was becoming too self-important and possibly a threat. So they were going to be absorbed into the Russian army. And that is what flipped Yevgeny Prigozhin into mounting this mutiny. And he claimed that it wasn't a coup attempt, that it was simply to throw out the people like Lavrov and sort of head towards Moscow. And it's interesting that today you still get Putin turning up in Rostov-on-Don to see the sort of the high command there, the army command, and see what's going on and give orders, etc., etc. But the reason he does that was of course where Prigozhin and his forces camped. They took over Rostov-on-Don, took over the headquarters, and then moved towards Moscow far more rapidly than anyone could have predicted. This is what happens with mutiny. You never quite know whether it's going to catch on, whether it's going to tip into being a full-blown coup attempt. And this is why the authorities and the armed forces as a whole are very cautious, are very keen to put down mutinies as quickly as possible. And so the Wagner Group demonstrates that mutiny is still on the agenda and still a problem. And I certainly don't think it's going to be the last you see among the Russian armed forces, given the winter they're about to go through.
There you have it, mutiny. When people live in poor conditions or there are cultural differences, political differences, ideological differences, societies can be ruptured by mass desertion, strikes, assassinations, and rebellion against their superiors. Then you have a mutiny on your hands. Thank you, Jamie.
Thanks, Tom.
You have been listening to Bloody Violent History. Please pass this episode on. My name is Tom Assheton. His name is
James Jackson, I think.
Thank you and good luck.